The rifle was already cocked when Thomas Wilcox stepped through the door of the Gentry Ranch house, and the woman holding it did not flinch. She stood behind the heavy oak table she had dragged into position 3 hours before his arrival, her dark hair pulled back from her face, her green eyes steady and cold as creek water in February. The lantern behind her threw her shadow long across the floorboards, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the Winchester barrel pointed at his sternum. "You move another inch," Lydia Gentry said, her voice low and absolutely certain, "and I will put a round through you before you draw that Colt from your holster." Do not test me on this. Thomas Wilcox had ridden into 100 dangerous situations in his 32 years. He had stared down marshals, riverboat gamblers, and men who had been killing since before he was old enough to shave. But the woman in front of him was different in a way he could not immediately name, and his boots stopped moving of their own accord. The rope was the first thing he noticed. It ran in a careful line from the door hinge behind him to a series of pulleys she had rigged from iron hooks in the ceiling beams, and from those pulleys down to something he could not yet see beneath the table. In the half-second it took him to trace the line, he also noticed the second trigger mechanism she had built into the far wall, and the third one she had disguised as an ordinary lantern bracket near the window. He had walked into a trap so elegantly constructed that he had not noticed a single element of it until he was already inside it. "Well," Thomas said, and for the first time in years the word came out without its usual edge of danger, because what he was feeling was not fear and was not anger. It was something closer to awe. "You knew I was coming." "I knew someone was coming 3 days ago," Lydia said. "I just needed to know whether to set the trap or pack my bags." "You made the decision for me when you burned the fence line on the north pasture last night." He had not burned that fence line, but standing there with a rifle pointed at his chest inside a mechanical trap he had not seen coming, Thomas Wilcox decided that this particular correction could wait. 3 days earlier, the land around the Gentry Ranch had been quiet in the way that trouble always goes quiet before it arrives. The drought had been grinding on the territory for 2 full seasons, and that kind of hardship had a way of making desperate men out of ordinary ones. Thomas had not started out as an outlaw in the pure sense of the word. He had started out as a man who made bad choices in service of a worse employer, and by the time he understood the full shape of what he had signed onto, he was already 3 counties into something he could not simply walk away from. His employer was a man named Carlton Briggs, and Carlton Briggs wanted the Gentry Ranch. Briggs had acquired half the valley by 1883 through means that were never entirely legal but were never entirely provable either. He held mortgages on 3 neighboring spreads and had let them slip into foreclosure by arranging, quietly and without visible involvement, for those families to suffer just enough misfortune that they could not make their payments. A water diversion here, a cattle spooked and scattered there, a storage barn that caught fire on a night when the wind was wrong. Briggs had a talent for engineering ruin at a comfortable distance, and he had a dozen men in his employ who were willing to be the hands that carried out that engineering. Thomas Wilcox was supposed to be the latest addition to those hands. He had ridden into the territory 2 weeks before, following a letter of introduction and a set of instructions that Briggs had written with the careful language of a man who had learned to say everything in terms that could not be used against him in a court of law. The instructions amounted to this: go to the Gentry property, make the woman who lived there understand that her position was untenable, and secure her agreement to sell at the price Briggs was offering. The price Briggs was offering was an insult. Thomas had known that the moment he read the number. He had also known, in the hollow and uncomfortable way that a man knows things he would rather not face, that Briggs's definition of securing an agreement had never required the other party's genuine consent. What Thomas had not known, what nobody in the territory seemed to know except perhaps the woman herself, was that Lydia Gentry was not going to be moved. She had come to the valley 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1879, with her father Daniel Gentry, and the sort of fierce optimism that most people shed within the first winter on the frontier. Daniel Gentry had been a man of extraordinary practical intelligence, a former engineer who had left the railroad after the death of his wife and taken his daughter west to start something of his own on land that nobody else had yet wanted. The land nobody wanted was rocky on the eastern edge and prone to flooding in the draws on the west, and Daniel Gentry had looked at it and seen exactly what other homesteaders had missed. There was water. Not obvious water, not the creek that dried up every summer or the spring that everybody could see from the road. There was deep water, reachable water, the kind that a man who understood geology and engineering could bring to the surface with the right combination of digging and patience and mechanical ingenuity. Daniel Gentry had spent 2 years building a water system that fed the ranch through a network of hand-dug channels and a clever pumping mechanism he had designed himself, drawing on principles from engineering manuals he had carried west in a leather satchel that was worn thin at the corners. By the time the drought began, the Gentry Ranch was the only property in the valley that was not watching its grass turn to straw. That was, in the accounting of men like Carlton Briggs, the entire point. A water source in a drought year was worth more than gold, and whoever controlled the Gentry Ranch controlled the water, and whoever controlled the water controlled the valley. Daniel Gentry had died in the autumn of 1882. He had been thrown from a horse on a rocky stretch of trail, and the injury to his head had taken him in 3 days without ever giving him the chance to say goodbye properly. He left the ranch to Lydia, along with his engineering manuals, his tools, his careful hand-drawn maps of the water system, and the set of practical skills she had been absorbing from him since she was old enough to hold a wrench. What she did not leave with was anyone to help her hold on to it. Her nearest neighbor, a widow named Clara Potts, was 80 miles to the southeast and in no position to offer assistance. The town of Redfield, 22 miles to the west, had a sheriff who was a decent enough man but thin on courage where Carlton Briggs was concerned. Lydia had ridden to Redfield in December, 3 months after her father's death, and laid out her suspicions about the pressure Briggs was applying to her neighbors. Sheriff Amos Creech had listened carefully and done nothing. The reasons he gave were all technically true. There was no proof. There was nothing he could act on. The law required evidence. Lydia had ridden home through the cold and made her own plans. She was 26 years old. She had her father's engineering mind and her own particular brand of stubbornness, which was less the hot stubborn of anger and more the cold stubborn of someone who has decided that a thing is going to be a certain way and has stopped spending energy on doubt. She had read every book her father owned, including the military engineering manuals he had acquired from a Union officer he once worked with, and she had been quietly and methodically preparing for the possibility that someone would come for her ranch since the morning after she buried him. The trap Thomas Wilcox had walked into on that late April evening in 1883 was the culmination of 4 months of work. She had started with the rope system. The pulleys were made from wheel hubs she had salvaged from a broken-down wagon, carefully remounted and positioned with a mathematical precision that accounted for load and friction in a way that would have impressed the engineer who designed the Brooklyn Bridge. The trigger mechanisms at the door and window were derived from a crossbow release design she had found in one of her father's older books, modified to work with the materials available to her on the frontier. But the most important part of the trap was not the ropes or the pulleys or the triggers. The most important part was the lamp oil. She had rigged a series of glass bottles above each of the 3 entry points to the house, each one connected to a release mechanism that, if triggered, would shatter the bottle and spread flammable oil across a 6-foot section of the floor. A match, or even the spark from a discharged firearm, would ignite the oil in turn whichever entry point had been forced into an immediate wall of fire. Not enough fire to burn the house down, she had calculated carefully, but more than enough to stop a man from advancing. The final component was a flare mechanism she had built outside, connected by a wire she had run underground for 60 yards to a position behind the fence line, which would, when triggered from inside the house, send a signal visible from Redfield on a clear night. She had ridden to Redfield 2 weeks before and told Deputy Harlan Voss, who was a more courageous man than his sheriff, exactly what the signal would mean and exactly what she needed him to do when he saw it. Voss had promised to come, and she believed he meant it, but she had built the rest of the trap to function whether Voss arrived or not. Thomas Wilcox had walked through her door, and the trap had worked exactly as designed. Now he stood there in the lamplight, tracking the rope lines with his eyes, and she watched him understand what she had built. She watched him understand it completely. She watched his expression move through surprise and then through something more complex, a kind of reckoning, like a man who has been shown a proof of something he thought was impossible and is having to rebuild his understanding of the world around the evidence. "How many of those mechanisms are live right now?" Thomas asked. "All 3 entry points," Lydia said. "The one at the window behind you will be triggered if you draw your sidearm. The one at the back door is on a timer I set an hour ago, which means you have about 40 minutes before it releases on its own whether you are standing there or not." Thomas looked at the window behind him, then back at her. "You built a timer. Clockwork spring from my father's watch. It was not a complicated modification." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since November," she said. "I was not sure which of Briggs's men would come, but I was fairly certain someone would. His patience has been getting shorter with every family that refused to sell. The Alderman place was the last one he took before he turned his attention back to me. The Alderman family." Thomas felt the weight of that. He had not been involved in what happened to the Aldermans, but he knew what had happened. Briggs's men had made the misfortune happen, and the Aldermans had sold for pennies and moved east, and 4 children had grown up not knowing the land their parents had broken their backs to build. "I didn't burn your fence line," Thomas said. Lydia studied him. The rifle did not lower. "No," she said after a moment. "I know you didn't. That was Briggs's other man, the one who came through the east draw 2 nights ago. I let him think he wasn't seen." "Then why are you pointing that rifle at me?" "Because you came here to take my ranch." There was no argument to be made against that. Thomas had come to take her ranch. Those were his instructions, and he had ridden out with full knowledge of what they meant. "Yes," he said, "I did." It was the honesty that surprised her. Lydia had been prepared for denial, for justification, for the various kinds of self-serving explanation that she had watched men deploy when caught in something they would rather not own. She had not been prepared for a clean, undefended admission of guilt from a man who had just demonstrated the presence of mind to read a complex mechanical trap from inside it. "Then what," she said carefully, "do you want me to do with that information?" "I want you to let me sit down," Thomas said, "and I want to tell you something about Carlton Briggs that I think will change the shape of this situation considerably." The rifle stayed up. "Talk first, sit second." So he talked. He told her about the letter Briggs had sent him. He told her about the instructions. He told her that Briggs had a document, a false deed of sale dated 2 years previous, which he intended to present to the county land office as proof that Lydia Gentry had agreed in principle to sell the property before his death. The document was a forgery, but it was a good one, and Briggs had a county clerk in his pocket who would certify it without asking questions. He told her that Briggs's plan was not to frighten her off the land. Briggs's plan was to use the forged deed to file a legal claim against the property, while simultaneously making her situation difficult enough that she would not have the resources to fight the claim in court. The intimidation was not meant to make her leave. It was meant to make her poor and isolated and unable to mount a legal defense before she understood what was really happening. Lydia listened to all of this without moving and without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How do you know about the forged deed?" she asked. "Because I was in the room when Briggs explained it to his lawyer," Thomas said. I was supposed to be there to hear the plan so I would know what I was helping to accomplish. Briggs wanted everyone who worked for him to understand the full picture so nobody could claim later that they had been uninformed. That is an unusual approach for a criminal enterprise. Briggs is an unusual man, Thomas said. He believes that culpability shared among many people is culpability diluted for each individual. He calls it distributed risk. Lydia considered this. You could have left. When you understood what the plan was. I could have, Thomas said. I didn't, not at first. Why not at first? Thomas was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she almost fired a prompt at him, but something held her back. There was a quality to his silence that was different from evasion. It was more like a man looking at a piece of ground he has been avoiding and deciding that he is finally going to step onto it. Because I owed Briggs money, he said. Not a small amount. Enough that refusing the job would have had consequences I was not in a position to absorb. Gambling debts. No, Thomas said. Nothing so simple, my brother. He got into something 2 years ago in a different county, something bad enough that the alternative to buying his way clear of it was a hanging. Briggs paid it. Briggs does that sometimes. He finds men with obligations and he collects on them when it suits him. Lydia understood that dynamic. She had seen versions of it operate across the frontier, the slow accumulation of leverage that turned free men into tools of someone else's ambition. Her father had talked about it in terms of structural pressure, the way water wore stone not by force but by persistence and by finding the existing cracks. Your brother is safe, she asked. Thomas blinked. It was not the question he had expected. Yes. He's in Missouri now, married, has a child. Then your debt is paid in function if not in Briggs's accounting, she said. You delivered the result he bought. He has no further moral claim on your brother's safety, which means the only thing keeping you here now is fear. It was such a precise dismantling of his situation that Thomas felt the air move out of the room. She had taken his explanation and in 2 sentences had exposed the exact nature of the choice in front of him, and she had not done it unkindly. She had done it the way a good engineer identifies where a structure is actually failing, not cruelly but accurately. You're very clear-eyed, he said. My father taught me to look at problems that way, she said. Take the problem apart, find the actual load-bearing elements, everything else is distraction. What are the actual load-bearing elements here? Thomas asked. Briggs has a forged deed, Lydia said. He has a corrupt clerk. He has a plan that depends on me being isolated and underfunded by the time he files the legal claim, and he has you, or at least he thinks he does. That last part is negotiable, Thomas said. The rifle lowered, not all the way down, not to her side, but enough, 2 inches, 3. Thomas did not move. If I let you sit down, Lydia said, and we talk about what you actually know about Briggs's operation, and how that knowledge might be used to stop the filing of that deed, then you need to understand something first. Tell me. I am not in the habit of trusting people, she said. Not because I am suspicious by nature, because the last 18 months have given me specific and concrete reasons to be careful. So if you sit down at that table and we make any kind of arrangement, and I later discover that arrangement was itself a manipulation, there will not be a second conversation. Fair, Thomas said. I am not finished, Lydia said. The second thing is that I am going to send the flare signal to Deputy Voss regardless of whether we reach an arrangement. He will arrive tomorrow or the day after, and when he does, he is going to need to hear what you have told me directly from you. So whatever you decide to do in this room tonight, you will need to be willing to repeat it in front of a law officer. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the serious planes of her face, the fine structure of her jaw, the set of her shoulders that carried absolutely no performance in them, no softening for the benefit of the man she was speaking to, no adjustment of her presentation toward any kind of expected femininity. She was entirely and precisely herself, and she was telling him exactly what the terms were and what the consequences would be if he violated them. He had never met a person quite like her. All right, he said. Tell me where to sit. She moved to the side of the table and gestured to the chair across from her. He crossed the room carefully, navigating the rope lines, and sat. She sat across from him, the rifle resting across her knees, within easy reach but no longer aimed. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me everything you know about the deed." Thomas started from the beginning. He talked for over an hour. Lydia listened without interrupting, but her hands were moving the entire time, writing in a notebook she had taken from the shelf behind her, not transcribing his words verbatim but mapping the information, drawing connections, sketching a diagram of Briggs's plan that looked less like notes and more like an engineering schematic. Every time Thomas mentioned a name, she wrote it down. Every time he cited a location, she added it to the map she was building on the right-hand page. At one point, Thomas paused and watched her work for a moment. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm building a structure," she said without looking up. "A case is what a lawyer makes. A structure is what holds up under pressure." "What's the difference?" She looked up then. "A case depends on argument. A structure depends on the arrangement of facts. If I arrange the facts correctly, the structure holds regardless of how skillfully someone argues against it. I want something that cannot be talked away." Thomas leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since he had ridden into the valley, he felt something that might have been hope. Not the reckless optimism of a gambling man, but the considered hope of someone who has looked at a problem alongside someone capable of solving it and recognized that the solving might actually be possible. "Briggs's lawyer is a man named Aldous Crane," Thomas said. "He operates out of the county seat at Forreston. He has an office on the second floor of the Merchants Bank building. The deed is kept in his office safe." Lydia's pen stopped moving. "You know where the deed is," she said. "I was in Crane's office when Briggs showed it to me," Thomas said. "Crane put it back in the safe himself." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Thomas watched something happen in her eyes that he did not have a word for. It was not excitement exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who has been working a calculation for a long time and has suddenly arrived at a result that confirms their approach was correct all along. "Then we don't need to just defend against the filing," she said slowly. "If we could recover the document before it's filed and deliver it to a federal authority rather than the county, we remove the clerk from the equation entirely. How would you recover it from Crane's safe?" "I wouldn't need to," Lydia said. "If we have your testimony about the existence and the content of the deed, combined with a sworn statement about Briggs's plan, a federal marshal can compel the production of the document. Crane cannot refuse a federal order, and if he destroys the document ahead of that, the destruction itself becomes evidence of intent." Thomas stared at her. "You understand federal legal procedure." "I understand how systems work," she said. "The legal system is a system. It has load-bearing elements, same as anything else. The load-bearing element in this case is federal jurisdiction, because Briggs has invested all of his planning in the assumption that this stays at the county level, where he controls the relevant officials." "That's correct," Thomas said. "He's never considered the possibility that anyone would go federal. Because the women he's pushed off their land before didn't know how," Lydia said. "There was no self-pity in it. It was an observation delivered flatly like a measurement." "No," Thomas agreed. "They didn't." Lydia set down her pen and looked at him with the direct and steady focus that Thomas was already beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things she was taking seriously. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You came here for Briggs. What changed?" Thomas looked at his hands for a moment, the wide, rough hands of a man who had spent years on the wrong side of too many things. "I walked through your door," he said, "and I found what you had built in here. And I understood in about 30 seconds that the plan Briggs sent me here with was never going to work, because the person he sent me to intimidate cannot be intimidated. She can only be engaged with honestly or not at all." He paused. "I'd rather be honest." Lydia did not say anything immediately. She looked at him with that measuring look, the one that seemed to go all the way through whatever it was directed at, and then she nodded once. "Then let's plan," she said. They worked through the night. Thomas had not intended to, but the conversation refused to end, because every time they resolved one thread of the problem, Lydia would identify the next thread and pull on it, and Thomas would have to reach back into his memory for the specific details that her questions required. She was extraordinarily good at asking the right questions. She never asked a question that was not aimed at something structural, something that would clarify the architecture of Briggs's plan in a way that could be acted on. Around midnight, she made coffee on the cast iron stove in the corner, and the domesticity of the act was so at odds with the mechanical trap still rigged around the room that Thomas felt the dissonance of it as something almost funny, which surprised him considerably. "Are you going to dismantle that before you go to sleep?" he asked, nodding toward the rope system. "I'll dismantle the timers," she said. "The rest I'll leave up until Deputy Voss arrives, in case Briggs sends his other man back tonight." "The other man Briggs sent is named Pete Callow," Thomas said. "He's dangerous in a direct way, not subtle. He's the one who burned the fence line." "I know the type," Lydia said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups with the same efficient precision she applied to everything else. "I'm less concerned about the direct type. They are easier to anticipate." "You were not what I expected," Thomas said. She brought the cups to the table and sat back down, pushing one toward him. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly," he said honestly. "Briggs described you as an obstacle, a woman alone on a failing property who needed to be persuaded that holding on was foolish." "The property is not failing," Lydia said. "The water system my father built is performing at full capacity. The cattle are healthy. The eastern pasture produced a yield last year that would have been impossible on any comparable acreage in this drought without the irrigation." "Briggs knows that," Thomas said. "That's why he wants it." "I know that's why he wants it," Lydia said. "That's why I'm not leaving." There it was. That simple, absolute statement, sitting in the room between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I am not leaving." Not as a plea, not as desperation, not as bravado, just as fact. Thomas drank his coffee and felt something inside him that had been aligned in a certain direction for a long time begin to shift. Over the next 2 days, the plan took full shape. Deputy Voss arrived the following evening, coming in from the North Road with 2 other men he trusted, and Thomas repeated everything he had told Lydia, this time in front of witnesses. Voss listened with a focused gravity and then confirmed what Lydia had suspected. The federal marshal's office in Santa Fe had an open inquiry into Carlton Briggs that had never gained sufficient traction because witnesses had consistently failed to materialize. Thomas Wilcox was about to materialize. "This is going to make you a target," Voss told him, not unkindly. "Briggs has reach." "I know," Thomas said. "Are you sure?" Thomas glanced across the room at Lydia, who was at her work table, writing out a careful and meticulous account of the forged deed and everything Thomas had told her about it, organized in the systematic way she organized everything. She looked up, caught his glance, and held it for a brief moment before returning to her work. "I'm sure," Thomas said. Voss drafted the letter to the federal marshal's office that night, and one of his men rode out before dawn to carry it to Forreston, where it would go onto the territorial telegraph. The response, Voss estimated, would take 4 to 6 days. What they needed to do in those 4 to 6 days was keep Briggs from acting. This was the problem, because Briggs, without hearing from Thomas or from Pete Callow, was going to assume that something had gone wrong, and when Briggs assumed something had gone wrong, he was not the type to wait and see. "He'll send more men," Thomas said at the breakfast table the following morning. He and Lydia and Voss were sitting over cold biscuits and a pot of coffee that Lydia had made strong enough to strip paint, which Thomas had already decided he preferred. "Probably 2 or 3. Callow will come back with reinforcements." "How long do we have?" Voss asked. "If he sent a rider when he didn't hear back from me by last night, which is what his instruction was, then probably 3 days. Maybe 4 if the riders encounter any trouble on the road." Voss looked at Lydia. "Miss Gentry, What's your read on this property as a defensive position? Thomas watched Lydia's expression do something interesting. It was not pleasure exactly. It was more the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask them the right question. She stood up and went to the large sheet of paper pinned to the wall beside the fireplace, which Thomas had assumed was a property map. Looking at it now from across the room, he revised his assessment. It was a property map, yes, but it was annotated with firing positions, natural cover points, lines of approach from each direction rated by the cover they provided, and a series of symbols he had not initially recognized as defensive planning. From the north, the approach is open across about 200 yards of pasture before you hit the tree line, Lydia said, pointing to the map with the same calm authority she brought to everything. Anyone crossing that open ground can be watched from the roof of the house or from the feed barn, which has a better angle to the northwest. From the east, there are 3 draws that provide cover. The largest one is where your man came through the night he burned the fence line. She had already figured out where Callow had come from before Thomas had told her his name. I've rigged a string line across the bottom of the east draw, she continued. Not to stop anyone, just to hear them. It's connected to 2 tin cans filled with pebbles hung on the wall of the hay barn. If someone crosses that draw at night, I'll know within about 2 minutes of them crossing. Voss was staring at the map. You did all this yourself. My father was an engineer, Lydia said. I paid attention. Ma'am, Voss said, with the particular tone of a man who has just significantly revised his understanding of a situation, I think this property might be more defensible than the Redfield jail. Thomas found himself laughing. It was not planned and it was not polite. It was just real, and it came out before he could moderate it. Lydia looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes that he was beginning to read correctly, which was not irritation but the edge of something that was trying not to be amusement. The Redfield jail, she said, has 1 set of bars and a lock that I could pick with a hairpin. You've never picked it, Voss said, slightly alarmed. I haven't needed to, she said. That was a theoretical assessment. Thomas laughed again, and this time Lydia's expression broke slightly at the corner, a tiny, precise movement that he found he wanted to see again almost immediately. The next 3 days were, in their particular way, the strangest and most clarifying days Thomas Wilcox had spent since he could remember. He worked alongside Lydia from sunrise to sunset, helping her reinforce the defensive positions she had identified, carrying materials, following her instructions on where to position things and how, and absorbing gradually and unmistakably the fact that she was significantly better than he was at this. Not at physical tasks. He outmatched her on anything requiring raw strength, which she acknowledged without any apparent resentment, directing him to the tasks that required it with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. But at the spatial reasoning, the tactical planning, the identification of leverage points and vulnerabilities, she was operating at a level that Thomas had simply never encountered before. He had met smart men, cunning men, men with the particular wolf intelligence that the frontier seemed to either produce or destroy. Lydia Gentry was something else. On the second day, he found her on the roof of the feed barn with a compass and a length of string, sighting angles and writing numbers in her notebook, and he climbed up and asked what she was doing. Calculating the effective range from each roof position using estimated rifle trajectories, she said, not looking up from her compass. The rifle I have is a Winchester model 1873. Its effective accurate range in competent hands is about 150 yards. I want to know which approach angles an attacker could use that would bring them within my effective range before they reached a position where they could return fire from cover. Thomas sat on the barn roof and watched her work for a long moment. She moved the string and took another sighting and wrote down a number. You calculated firing angles, he said. Preliminary calculations, she corrected. I'll verify them against actual ground measurements this afternoon. Lydia, It was the first time he had used her name without her surname attached, and both of them noticed it. She paused and looked at him. "Where did you learn all of this?" She considered the question for a moment. "My father had books about military engineering. I read them. I had questions and he answered them. I had more questions and he found more books." She paused again. "I did not set out to be someone who builds defensive systems on an isolated property in a drought year with hostile men coming down the road. I set out to understand how things work, because understanding how things work meant I would never be helpless." There was something in that sentence that went to the center of Thomas Wilcox's chest and lodged there like a warm coal. "He would be proud of you," Thomas said. Lydia looked at him, and for a moment her composure showed its first real seam, a slight catch of something in her expression that passed quickly but that he saw. "I know he would," she said quietly. Then she looked back at her compass and took another reading. Pete Callow came back on the third night, and he brought 2 men with him. Thomas heard them first, because he had taken the first watch and was positioned in the hay barn with a clear line to the east draw. The tin cans rattled at 2 in the morning, and he moved to the house without running, because running made noise and noise was the enemy of any defensive position. He woke Lydia with a hand on her shoulder, and she was awake and dressed and out the door in the time it would have taken most people to sit up. Deputy Voss and his men took their positions. Thomas went to the roof of the feed barn, which Lydia had identified as the best sight line to the east approach. What happened next was not a violent confrontation in the way that the frontier stories usually told such things, because Lydia had planned for this too. The position she had identified for Voss's men meant that Callow and his 2 companions, coming up through the east draw in the darkness, found themselves silhouetted against the open pasture the moment they cleared the tree line, caught in a crossfire of lanterns that Lydia had rigged on timer mechanisms to ignite simultaneously. The sudden, blinding light from 4 directions disoriented all 3 of them completely. Voss's voice came across the silence from a position Callow could not identify. "Pete Callow, you are under arrest by authority of the Deputy Sheriff of Redfield County. Drop your weapons and put your hands up." There was a frozen moment. Thomas watched from the barn roof as Callow's instinct to fight warred with his instinct to survive, the lantern light catching his face, a face twisting through calculations that all came out the same way. The weapons dropped. The hands went up, all 3 of them. Lydia had built a light trap. Thomas had not thought of it in those terms until it was happening. But as he watched Callow stand in the flood of brilliant lantern light with his hands in the air, he understood exactly what she had done. She had not tried to stop them with force. She had stopped them with disorientation, removing their ability to identify the threat, to locate their opponents, to make the offensive calculations necessary to fight. She had defeated 3 armed men with light and geometry and careful planning, and nobody had fired a shot. When Thomas climbed down from the barn roof and came across the yard to where Voss's men were binding Callow's wrists, Lydia was standing at the edge of the light with her Winchester held at her side, watching the proceedings with the particular satisfaction of someone whose design has performed exactly as intended. Thomas stopped beside her. "The lantern's on the timer," he said. 3-minute intervals from when I set them, keyed to the tin cans rattling," she said. "I reset the timers when you woke me. In the 30 seconds between me waking you and leaving the house." 22 seconds, she said. I counted. Thomas stood in the bright artificial noon of the lanterns in the middle of the dark night and looked at the woman beside him, and the feeling that had been building in him for 3 days arrived at something definitive. It was not admiration, though it was certainly that. It was not gratitude, though that was certainly present too. It was something older and more fundamental than either of those. The thing that happens when you meet someone whose mind and character are so fully themselves that you cannot imagine the world as it existed before you knew they were in it. He was, with a certainty that surprised him in its clarity, falling in love with Lydia Gentry. The federal marshal arrived 5 days later, not the 4 to 6 that Voss had estimated, because the telegraph office in Forreston had flagged the message as urgent, and it had reached Santa Fe faster than expected. Marshal Jonathan Reach was a lean, unhurried man of 50 who had the particular quality of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had learned to see clearly without noise. He listened to Thomas for 2 hours. He read Lydia's written account. He interviewed Voss. He took statements from the 2 men who had ridden with Callow, who were both willing to cooperate in exchange for consideration on the charges against them. At the end of this process, Marshal Reach rode to Forreston, accompanied by 2 deputies, and paid a visit to the law office of Aldous Crane. The visit was brief, and its outcome was not complicated. Crane, presented with a federal warrant and the specific and accurate knowledge that a witness had described the contents of his safe, made the decision that his loyalty to Carlton Briggs was not worth a federal obstruction charge and produced the forged deed. The deed was examined by a document examiner the marshal brought from Santa Fe, who confirmed within a day that the signature attributed to Daniel Gentry had been produced after his death, a determination made possible by the comparison of the signature with dated correspondence from the Gentry estate, which Lydia had preserved and organized with her characteristic meticulousness. Carlton Briggs was arrested at his ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon in May 1883 on charges that included land fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and several additional counts that arose from the cooperation of Crane and Callow's companions. He was transported to Santa Fe to await trial, and because the charges were federal, the corrupt county clerk in Redfield had no mechanism to affect the proceedings. Briggs went to prison. He died there 7 years later, and the valley did not mourn him. The morning after the marshal rode out with his prisoners, Thomas Wilcox saddled his horse in the Gentry barn and prepared to do something he had not done in years, which was leave a place without being chased out of it. He had told himself, repeatedly and with the particular insistence of someone arguing against their own instincts, that leaving was the right thing. He had come to this ranch as an agent of a man who had intended to destroy it. He had changed sides, yes. He had done the right thing eventually. But he was still the man who had ridden in with instructions to take what belonged to Lydia Gentry, and the fact that he had ultimately not carried out those instructions did not fully erase what they had been. He was leading his horse out of the barn when Lydia appeared in the barn doorway. She was dressed as she always was, practically and without excess, her hair done up in the braid she wore during working hours. She had a cup of coffee in each hand, and she held one out toward him with the steady directness that was simply how she did things. He took the cup. They stood in the early morning quiet of the barn doorway, and the light was coming in gold and clean from the east, and the ranch looked the way that good land always looks in good morning light, like something worth everything it has cost. "You're leaving," she said. "I thought I should," Thomas said. "Why?" He turned the cup in his hands. "Because of how I got here." "You got here because Briggs sent you," Lydia said. "You stayed because you decided to." Those are 2 different facts, and conflating them doesn't serve any useful purpose. Lydia, her name, just her name, the way he said it was different from every other word he said, and both of them understood that. "I came to take your ranch." "You didn't take it," she said. "In the end, you helped me keep it. Those are the facts as they stand. The fact as it stands is that I still don't have a good reason for you to want me here." Lydia was quiet for a moment. The morning birds were starting in the fence posts along the pasture, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird was running through its repertoire with cheerful indiscrimination. She drank her coffee and looked at him with the look that went all the way through things. "I am not someone who makes decisions based on sentiment," she said finally. "You've been here for 8 days. In those 8 days, I have observed you closely because that is how I understand things. And what I have observed is a man who, when presented with correct information, does the correct thing. A man who does not flinch from an honest accounting of himself. A man who, when I tell him where to place a defensive position, places it there without arguing about his pride." She paused. A man who asked me why I learned to do what I do and actually listened to the answer. Thomas looked at her. Those are the reasons I might want you to stay, she said. They are rational reasons. I want to be clear that they are rational. And if I told you I had a less rational reason for wanting to stay? Thomas said. Something happened in Lydia's expression that he had been waiting for. It was very small, as her expressions always were. A slight softening at the corners of her eyes, the faintest color in her cheekbones. She looked briefly away toward the pasture and then back at him. I might, she said with careful precision, want to hear that reason. I don't want to leave, Thomas said simply. I've been in a lot of places and I've never been in one where I wanted to stay. This is the first one. And the property is beautiful, but it's not the property. Lydia's chin came up slightly, which he had learned meant she was processing something that had affected her more than she intended. You should stay, she said. There's a lot of work to do on the north pasture fence line, and the water pump in the east channel needs a new valve seat. I've been meaning to address that for 2 weeks. I can fix a valve seat, Thomas said. I know you can, she said. I've watched you work. He smiled at that, and she looked at the smile with the slight narrowing of her eyes that was her version of smiling back. He stayed. The weeks that followed had a texture that Thomas had not previously associated with his own life, which was simply the texture of days that were good because of the substance within them, rather than despite it. He worked the ranch alongside Lydia with the easy cooperation of 2 people whose skills complemented rather than competed. She directed the technical work, the irrigation system maintenance, the mechanical upkeep of the pump and the rigging and the barn equipment, with a confident expertise that he stopped being surprised by and simply began relying on, the way you rely on something solid. He handled the physical labor, the fence repair, the cattle work, the hay cutting and stacking, and the endless variety of tasks that a working ranch required, with a competence and willingness that Lydia, he noticed, quietly tracked and appreciated. They talked. This was what surprised Thomas most. He had not expected, in the aftermath of the intensity of those first days, that the conversation would simply continue, but it did. It moved through subjects he had never discussed with another person, engineering and mechanics, and the geology of the valley and the history of land rights in the territory, but also through subjects that were more personal, his brother in Missouri, her father, the choices both of them had made and not made, the shape of a life that might be built deliberately rather than simply accumulated. One evening in June, sitting on the porch after supper, Lydia said, I've been thinking about the east pasture. What about it? Thomas said. The current irrigation channel doesn't reach the far eastern corner. My father planned an extension but ran out of time. With the water system at full capacity, we could extend the channel this summer and bring another 30 acres under cultivation. Winter wheat in the fall. Thomas looked out at the evening pasture, the grass long and green in the way that the neighboring spreads without the Gentry water system simply were not. That's a substantial project. Yes, Lydia said. I'll need help. She said it without difficulty, without the kind of pride that makes admitting need into something hard. It was simply an accurate assessment of the project's requirements. But Thomas heard the other thing in it, the thing that was not about the irrigation channel, and he looked at her in the warm evening light. You'll have it, he said. She looked at him steadily. Thomas. Yes. I am not experienced in this, she said. She meant the other thing, the thing that was not the irrigation channel. She said it with the same directness she said everything. Neither am I, he said. Not in the way that matters. She considered this. My father used to say that the only honest beginning is one where both people acknowledge the actual starting conditions. Your father was a wise man, Thomas said. He was, she said quietly. Thomas reached across the distance between the 2 porch chairs and put his hand over hers where it rested on the chair arm, and she looked down at their hands and then back at him, and he could see her processing the fact of it, taking in the warmth and the weight of his hand over hers with the same full attention she brought to everything. Then she turned her hand over and held his. They were married in September. The ceremony was held at the Redfield Church. a small timber building that the community used for everything from services to town meetings to the occasional dramatic legal dispute. It was presided over by Reverend Miles Cartwright, who had been in the territory since 1869 and had married a great many couples on the frontier, but who said afterward to his wife that he had rarely married two people who gave him the impression of having arrived at the decision the way a pair of engineers arrive at the conclusion of a proof, by following the evidence to where it inevitably led. Deputy Voss stood up for Thomas. Clara Potts, the widow from 80 miles south, had made the journey to stand up for Lydia, and the warmth between the two women made clear that the distance had not prevented a genuine friendship. The small congregation included two neighboring homesteading families who had survived Briggs's pressure without selling, as well as Marshall Reach, who had made the trip from Santa Fe in part because he felt the occasion deserved witness, and in part because he wanted to see with his own eyes how things had settled. Lydia wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself, practical and precisely fitted, and she wore her hair down for the first time that Thomas had seen. The effect of it stopped his breath somewhere in the second row of the church, and he did not recover it entirely until she reached the front and looked at him with those steady green eyes and the slight, precise softening that was her way of showing what she felt. He had, in the months since May, learned to read Lydia Gentry the way you learn to read a complex instrument, not by watching its surface, but by understanding what it was measuring. Every small expression translated to something large beneath it. Her slight narrowing of the eyes when she was suppressing amusement, the way she tilted her head when she was working through a problem that she had not yet solved, the particular quality of stillness she had when she was listening to something that mattered to her, the quality of stillness she had now, looking at him at the front of the church, was the one he had come to associate with things that mattered most. They said their vows in the plain, honest language of the territorial ceremony, and when he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had ordered from the jeweler in Forreston, she looked at it with the same complete attention she brought to everything new, and then looked up at him, and this time the softening in her eyes was not slight. The celebration afterward was the kind that frontier communities make when there is genuine reason to celebrate. Food that the neighboring families had contributed, a fiddle player from the town who had a repertoire of exactly 9 songs which he played in rotation, without apparent concern for the repetition, and the particular communal warmth of people who live in hard circumstances and know how to take genuine pleasure in good ones. Thomas danced with his wife, which involved Lydia following his lead with the systematic focus of someone learning a new mechanical process. And then, once she had the pattern, dancing with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and the look on her face, that of someone who has successfully mastered a new skill and finds it more satisfying than expected, made Thomas feel that he had married the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, which was, he reflected, exactly what he had done. They returned to the ranch that night and to the life they were building inside it. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard one across the territory, but the Gentry Ranch, which everyone now also thought of as the Wilcox Ranch, though Lydia kept Gentry in the property name because it was her father's, came through it without significant difficulty. The water system performed. The livestock were sheltered in the expanded barn that Thomas had built in October with lumber he had hauled from the mill in Forreston. The winter wheat that Lydia had planted in the extended east pasture survived under the snow and came up in March with a yield that made even Lydia's measured satisfaction visible on her face. She told him she was expecting their child in February. She told him in the way she told him things that were important, directly and after she had confirmed her assessment. She had determined she was likely in the family way in December and had waited until she was certain before raising the subject. February, Thomas said, meaning the month the child was expected. August, she said, meaning the month of delivery. I have been calculating from the onset of symptoms. Thomas looked at her across the kitchen table where they were eating supper, and the feeling that moved through him was something so large and warm that he did not immediately have words for it. "Are you well?" he managed. "Exceptionally," she said. "I have read the relevant medical literature. I am in good health and the pregnancy is progressing normally." "You've read the medical literature." "My father's library included 2 medical volumes," she said. "I augmented them with 2 additional texts I ordered from the bookseller in Santa Fe when I first suspected." Thomas stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that surprised both of them with its intensity, and she looked up at him with those green eyes that were steady and warm and utterly themselves. "I love you," he said, "in case I have not been clear on that." "You have been reasonably clear," she said. "I love you as well." A pause. "I have calculated that this expression of feeling is appropriate to the occasion." "It is absolutely appropriate to the occasion," he said, and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the full, focused attention she brought to everything she decided to do. Their son arrived in August of 1884, as Lydia had calculated, and they named him Daniel Thomas Wilcox, which was the right name and both of them knew it. He had Lydia's green eyes and Thomas's broad shoulders visible even in infancy, and Lydia studied him in the first hours after his birth with the same thorough attention she applied to new systems, learning his weight and his sounds and his particular responses with a focus so complete and so tender that Thomas, watching from the chair in the corner of the bedroom, felt the last remaining piece of something settle into place inside him. He was not an outlaw. He was not a tool of anyone's ambition. He was not a man with a dark past pulling him backward through the present. He was a man in a room with his wife and his son and the life they were building, and it was solid, and it was real, and it was his. Lydia recovered with her characteristic practicality and speed, and by October she was back at full operation, which included the extension of the irrigation survey to the western draw that she had been planning since summer. Daniel, in his cradle by the window, watched his mother work at the drafting table with the wide, patient eyes of a person who was taking in the world with interest. "He watches you the way you watch problems," Thomas said one afternoon, coming in from the barn, and finding the two of them in the same attitudes of focused attention. Lydia looked at Daniel and then at Thomas. "I hope he has your instincts," she said. "And I hope he has your mind," Thomas said. "Perhaps he'll have both," she said, and looked back at her drawing with the slight curve at the corner of her mouth that was her form of deepest satisfaction. The years that followed built on each other the way good things do, each one adding to the structure rather than undermining it. The ranch grew. The east pasture proved itself through 3 consecutive growing seasons of yields that were the best in the valley. Thomas, who had learned more in his first year alongside Lydia about land and water, and the mechanics of frontier agriculture than he had known in his entire previous life, began to be the person that neighboring homesteaders came to when they had mechanical problems with their own systems, and he would listen to their descriptions and then describe to them, accurately and simply, what he had observed Lydia do in similar situations. Lydia had in the meantime begun doing something she had not previously had time for: teaching. She had started with Clara Potts's granddaughter, a young woman named Beatrice who had come to stay with her grandmother, and who had shown the particular kind of quick and hungry intelligence that recognizes in Lydia a source of something she could not get elsewhere. Lydia had taught Beatrice mathematics, engineering fundamentals, agricultural science, and the reading and application of technical literature, with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. Word had spread, quietly at first and then less quietly, that the woman at the Wilcox Gentry ranch knew things that were useful to know and was willing to teach them. By the spring of 1886, Lydia had 4 students who came out to the ranch twice weekly from Redfield, young women primarily, though one of them was a boy of 15 whose family homesteaded to the north, and who had a mechanical mind that Lydia recognized and refused to ignore on grounds of whether it came attached to a girl or a boy. Thomas watched his wife teach the way he had watched her build her trap the first night, with the sense of someone seeing a process of significant consequence unfolding in front of him. She was not softer with her students than she was in any other context. She was equally direct, equally demanding of precision, equally unwilling to accept approximate answers. But she was patient in the particular way of someone who remembers learning, and she had the gift of explaining things in terms that started from what the student already understood. "You're changing things," Thomas told her one evening, after the students had gone and they were sitting on the porch with the same companionable ease they had always had in that chair-end porch hour at the end of the day. "I'm teaching people useful skills," she said. "Out here, that amounts to the same thing." She considered this. "My father believed that knowledge was the one resource that could not be taken away once it was properly transferred. He used to say that you could lose a property or a tool or a source of income, but if you understood the underlying principles you could rebuild." "He sounds like he would have had opinions about Carlton Briggs," Thomas said. Lydia smiled, genuinely and fully, the way she did more often now, 3 years into their marriage. "He would have taken the measure of Briggs in about 30 seconds and despised him thoroughly." "He would have liked you," Lydia added after a moment, with the particular quality in her voice that meant she was saying something she had been thinking about for a while. Thomas looked at her in the evening light. "I would have liked him," he said, "very much." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the quiet of the late afternoon with the sounds of the ranch settling around them, the cattle in the pasture, the water moving through the channel in the earth 30 yards away, the particular sound of Daniel in the house making the small sounds of a 2-year-old navigating the world on newly confident legs. In the summer of 1887, Lydia told Thomas she was expecting again, and this time her reading of the situation suggested a March delivery. She was correct within 4 days. Their daughter arrived on a rainy morning in March, and she was small and very loud, and had from the first hour a quality of focused intensity that made both parents look at each other with the recognition of something familiar. They named her Frances Eleanor Wilcox, and from the first year of her life, she climbed everything that could be climbed and studied everything that could be studied and brought to both activities the same quality of thorough engagement that was, unmistakably, her mother's legacy in the world. Daniel, who was nearly 3 when Frances arrived, approached his sister with the careful attention of someone who has been told that a new and important thing is happening and intends to understand it correctly. He crouched by the cradle on his first morning with her and looked at her very seriously for a long time and then looked up at Lydia. "She's small," he said. "Yes," Lydia agreed. "She will get bigger," Daniel said, confirming this to his own satisfaction. "She will," Lydia said. "She will likely give you a great deal of trouble." Daniel looked back at his sister. "That's all right," he said, with the placid acceptance of a child who has been raised in a household where difficulty is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be avoided. Thomas, watching from the doorway, felt something so large and warm and complete that it exceeded his available vocabulary, and he simply stood in it for a moment, the way you stand in good sunlight, present and grateful, and without any particular need to describe it. The ranch continued to grow. By 1888, Thomas had added a second barn and a workshop building specifically for Lydia's mechanical and engineering work, because the kitchen table had stopped being an adequate workspace somewhere around the second irrigation extension. The workshop had a full workbench, organized with the systematic precision that characterized all of Lydia's spaces, and a drafting table, and a shelf of technical volumes that was now considerably more extensive than Daniel Gentry's original library. Deputy Voss, who had been promoted to sheriff in 1886 after Creech retired, came out to the ranch for supper twice a year, which was a tradition he had established in the first year, and which no one had suggested discontinuing because the dinners were good, and the conversation was invariably interesting. He had married himself by then, a schoolteacher named Helen who had come to Redfield in 1885, and Helen and Lydia had quickly discovered in each other the kind of friendship that develops between people who think with similar clarity and are relieved to find someone who does. On one of these visits in the spring of 1888, Voss told them that Carlton Briggs had died in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. He delivered the information without ceremony, because it did not require any. Lydia received it with characteristic composure. Thomas watched something settle in her face, a very slight easing, the way a piece of machinery settles when a tension it has been compensating for is finally removed. She did not say anything for a moment. "The Alderman family," she said finally. "They sold to Briggs's intermediary for almost nothing. The intermediary was Crane, and Crane's assets were seized as part of the federal proceedings. Is anyone pursuing the question of what Crane's estate owes the families Briggs defrauded?" Voss exchanged a look with Thomas. "I can make inquiries," Voss said. "I'd appreciate that," Lydia said. "It won't restore what they lost, but a legal accounting might restore something." It was, Thomas thought, completely consistent with who she was. The thing that mattered to her was not the satisfying closure of knowing that Briggs was gone. The thing that mattered was what could still be done for the people who had been hurt. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, the same gesture that had started on the porch 4 years before, and Voss and Helen looked at each other with the slight smile of people who are watching something that has entirely found its form. In the summer of 1889, a young woman rode out to the Wilcox Gentry ranch from Redfield looking for Lydia. She was 19 years old, the daughter of one of the homesteading families to the north, and she had heard from Beatrice Potts that Mrs. Wilcox had a workshop and a library and a willingness to teach people who wanted to learn. Lydia sat with her for 2 hours on that first visit, assessing what she knew and what she needed, asking questions in the systematic way that established the baseline from which teaching could proceed. The young woman, whose name was Ruth Callahan, answered everything directly and without apology for what she did not know, which Lydia took as the most important quality. Thomas, building fence in the north pasture that afternoon, saw them sitting together through the workshop window as he came back in for water, Lydia at the drafting table and Ruth leaning forward in the chair across from her, both of them looking at something on the page between them with the same quality of focused attention. He stood for a moment in the yard with the late afternoon light coming in golden across the pasture, and he thought about the morning he had ridden into this valley with instructions that were a form of destruction, and he thought about the woman who had been waiting for him with a loaded rifle and a mechanical trap of extraordinary ingenuity, and he thought about every day of the 6 years since then, the work and the conversation and the children and the slow, solid, accumulating goodness of a life built with someone who approached everything she did with clarity and honesty, and the particular fierce gentleness of someone who understood that strength and care were not opposites. He thought about what it meant that she was in that workshop right now teaching a young woman who reminded her of herself, and that the territory around them was different, in small but real and measurable ways, because Lydia Gentry had refused to be moved, and had known how to hold what was hers. He brought water in from the pump and set it on the kitchen table and looked in on Daniel, who was 5 and asleep in the chair in the corner with a picture book open on his lap, the book upside down, which suggested he had been looking at the illustrations rather than any genuine attempt at reading. Frances, 2 years old, was in the cradle that had held her brother before her, wide awake and examining the ceiling with the same comprehensive attention she brought to all surfaces. Thomas picked her up and took her to the window and showed her the view she always tried to see from the floor, the pasture and the water channel and the mountains behind, and she looked at all of it with her mother's thoroughness, and then looked at her father with her mother's eyes. "That's ours," Thomas told her, which was a thing he said to both children and meant fully every time. Lydia came in from the workshop as the sun was finishing its work on the day, and she looked at Thomas holding Frances in the window light and stopped for a moment in the doorway with an expression that was open and complete and fully hers. "Ruth will come back next week," she said. "I know she will," Thomas said. Lydia crossed the room and stood beside him in the window, and Frances reached immediately for her mother's hair, which was down in the early evening hour the way it always was, and Lydia let her take it with the patient tolerance she had developed for this particular interest of her daughter's. "I was thinking," Lydia said, "about the roof of the feed barn." "What about it?" "The angle of the eaves could be modified," she said. "If we extend the south-facing pitch and add a collection channel, we could catch an additional 40 gallons per rainfall event and route it directly to the east cistern. It would require about 4 days of work." Thomas looked at her. "You're still designing systems." "I'm always designing systems," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "I love that about you." She looked at him with the green eyes that he had been reading for 6 years, and they were warm and steady and entirely themselves. And she said, with the precision that was how she said everything that was true, "I love you, Thomas." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Frances Wilcox, held between them, was unimpressed by the moment, and continued to investigate her mother's hair with methodical determination. Daniel stirred in his chair in the corner, and the picture book slid off his lap, and he blinked awake and looked at his family in the window with the equanimity of someone who has found the starting conditions of his world entirely satisfactory. The ranch was whole. The water ran clean and steady through the channels that Daniel Gentry had built and Lydia Gentry had maintained and extended, feeding the pastures and the cisterns and the livestock through drought and winter and the ordinary hard beauty of a frontier year. The fence lines were solid. The wheat in the east pasture was green and coming along. Ruth Callahan would come next week with her particular hungry intelligence, and Lydia would teach her things that could not be taken away. Thomas Wilcox had come to take a ranch, and instead he had learned, across 6 years of days that were the best of his life, what it meant to build one alongside a woman who had already known, with complete and uncompromising clarity, what she intended to hold and how to hold it. The trap had been the beginning of everything. The moment he had walked through that door and found the rope lines and the pulleys and the woman behind the rifle who was not afraid of him, and had felt for the first time the particular shock of encountering a mind and a character that outmatched his expectation by every measure. He had been remade by it, not broken, but remade the way good materials are remade when they meet the right design. He had been the outlaw. He had become, in the slow and solid and irreversible way of things that are truly built rather than merely assembled, the other half of something that was going to last. Outside the window, the valley held the last light of the day with the same patient endurance it had always had, and the water moved through the channels in the earth, and the ranch breathed in the evening air, alive and whole and deeply, permanently theirs.